Welcome to TechTalk Podcasts by Certes IT Service Solutions. In today's episode, we discuss technology budget. Is it an art or a science? We welcome back our host, Jon Grainger, to talk to Steve Butler, IT Transformation Director and author of the book, The Great Software Heist. They discuss the breakdown of the IT budget, best strategies for your resource budget and software budget, and the debate to build or to buy. Let's dive into part one.
So welcome everyone to the Certes podcast and vlog. I don't know how many of you listen to this or watch us in YouTube, but I can see the numbers are growing. And I think that's because we're continuing to get some great topics and of course some brilliant guests. So today I've got Steve Butler. So Steve, before we get into the main topic, which just as a sort of a working title, and the listeners and watchers will be used to these working titles, I'm sort of thinking of the technology budget. Is it an art? Is it a science? Just as a starting point. But Steve, just give us a little bit about your background. What you've done.
I almost accidentally sort of stumbled into realising I was rather good at saving money. And I've got a couple of clients I've worked with in the past where, you saved millions, in one case about 30 million a year. And I didn't actually go in to do that. It was a sort of byproduct of some things you did. And I think there's a realisation a bit later that I was actually good at that. And it's not the ruthless thing when you're slashing things, getting rid of people. It's not like that at all. Fundamentally, there are usually better ways of delivering IT. It's evolved, it's stagnated, we've got technical debt. And you had a number of challenges where you're simply trying to find ways of doing things better, working within the budget you've got. And I worked with a couple of big organisations, and I ended up actually building a benchmarking system, wrote a book, came out with a sort of approach for, I suppose, seeing where you are and the opportunities for saving money on the back of that.
Cool. I'm just thinking, because you've invested that time and effort to create your thoughts in the format of a book. You've already thought about how to deliver the topic, what the main areas are to come in. So if you and you think about our audience, there'll be people who have directly have IT budgets of all sorts of ranges, and I think there'll also be a series of IT stakeholders that look into the podcast to try and understand technology a bit more. So they might not have a direct IT budget, but they'll want to have that understanding. And my own personal experience is I run have an IT budget as well, so it'd be interesting if there's any observations I can chip in. But Steve, it's a huge topic. Where do you start?
I'll quite just think. I did a lot of research in the past. I was sort of building a consultancy with a friend who, for a number of reasons, it didn't sort of transpire at the time. But there's enormous opportunities in this space. If anything, it's one of the easiest areas in the IT budget to actually find opportunities to reduce costs. So I found some stats on IDC and a couple of other bodies. And I think just looking at these wages, typically about 2020s, 50% of the IT budget, give you an idea on that. Hardware is about 12%. Software is coming up 34% at that point, so software licensing, and miscellaneous, if you like, about 4%. There's two really big areas in there fundamentally. It's about the software costs, wage costs, and it sort of gives you a pointer to start looking at. And very often IT is always short of people to do things. It's always a struggle when you work to find a budget to get someone on it. Have they got spare time? There's a productivity challenge, if you like. It's not people work hard, but can we empower them? Things like that.
Steve, on your research, the IDC side of things, that split that you came up with, was that a kind of an average across all sectors, or was it a particular industry?
I think it was IT in general. It was a US study at the time. I think it was really people still migrating to the cloud and things, which obviously has some impact on that. But intriguingly enough, in that, the hardware at 12% says, yes, there's savings to be made, but it isn't the biggest area by any means.
Yeah, and Steve, apologies, I don't mean to interrupt you. Just you're sparking loads of thoughts in my brain. Yeah. On the hardware side, you could say when you've got that split. I mean, this is a hypothesis. It's not I'm not making a general rule, but just as a hypothesis, there's a scenario where you're spending 12% of your budget because you've underinvested in your hardware. You're in legacy. It's not being patched correctly. It might not be secure, and so there's a opportunity cost of staying with that hardware where you might say, well, actually, for us to do this properly, we'd be spending 50% of our budget on hardware. And I suppose people that are selling cloud services would say, oh, it's 70% of your budget, because obviously they're trying to make a cloud business case, because everyone's trying to kind of lean things in. But be interested in that side, because your current hardware cost isn't necessarily what you should be spending on hardware. Did you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, well, your technical debt is a huge subject, and the emotive one, not always easy to communicate to.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Very much.
And so we're talking about the split between software and people. I think are the two larger items. I think we should probably tackle the people element first, because, like you say, that's the one that's the most sensitive. I think, for good reason, because we'll, it has real implications for real people. So in terms of sort of people costs and people budget, and the sort of the insights that you've been able to glean on that, what have your observations been?
There's a number of sort of recurring topics across the various areas you're looking at, and one of the things is, I think, there's almost an emphasis on service. At the end of the day, your business needs to deliver a good service to people. And if you take that as a sort of overriding thing, very often, your investment in people really is about delivering a good service. It doesn't necessarily have to be the best in class. We always know what happens to politicians. When they talk about world class, almost guaranteed it's going to fail, I think. But so it's sort of be look at that in the first instance, and how do you empower people? A long time ago, in the early days of my career, I did some work around organisation methods, sort of business process re-engineering, and you pretty much get the stopwatch out. You start looking at processes, how do you improve them? And there's a lot of low-value task admin and things like that. And, even down to frameworks people use, per pet bugbear. We've got too many frameworks these days. They add a lot of costs, and they potentially waste quite a lot of time in some cases. So being pragmatic, can you reduce what people are spending the time on, which isn't productive?
Yes.
So they're focusing on helping the customer best, resolving calls quicker, almost engineering out recurring themes.
Do you want to try a framework? Call out a specific, or one that you think is more challenging than others?
I think, if anything, it's the sheer quantity of them. Because these days it's very difficult to get away from them. We've all been through the thing, in the past with, I think Prince would be a good example. Prince is a huge framework. In reality, you use 20% of it. Yeah. You have to go through the consultant saying you need this down to what sort of works for you.
Yes.
I think Safe Agile, one of the more recent ones, have got better in that sense, but it's still being careful, because you can spend a lot of time on data standards and things which aren't always productive.
Yeah, and this is where you get the meeting the target, missing the point. We ran Prince exactly to Prince principles. We recruited everyone and all the rest of it, but we didn't deliver on the outcome necessarily. Or let's say we did deliver on the outcome, but it turned out we could have done it with 50% less resourcing. And I think that's the whole point, is frameworks sometimes become very literally adopted. They're not seen as a sort of a guidance. I always say, when you talk about methodology, you've got method and you've got ology. You've got to have the ology bit, otherwise the method becomes just this thing you do. And why are we doing it? Oh, well, we've always done it that way. That kind of thing. So this is really interesting. So that could very much be in the category of what the IT team doesn't know. It doesn't know, because you're leaning in and looking at the framework around them, that it's just become accepted practice, but actually you've got savings to be made there. Okay, on technical debt, getting into, we can come back to people, by the way, Steve, if you've got other topics to raise, but just sort of moving around a little bit in the technical debt side of things, and the software piece. So we've got software at 34%, so it's a significant portion. What are the sort of areas, the 101 that you would look at in the software cost space?
Yeah, well, software it's a huge area. It's usually the easiest area to save money in, fundamentally. But what you will find is you'll be over-licensed, underutilized, all these sorts of things. Just give you an example, if you look at Microsoft Visio project, I remember a study a number of years ago actually saying that in one organization, literally one person in 10 actually use those tools regularly. And they're the most expensive ones in sort of Microsoft's catalog. And, pragmatic utilization of those can really get your costs down. There's a lot of project managers I know that don't use project, although they want it to produce the POAP, fundamentally that map, where they track everything in Excel and other tools. So you start with those sorts of areas. You need to look at them. If you've got software asset management, some of those tools actually give you quite good insight into utilization. There's also a whole range of other things. One of the big things I've run into in the past is the sort of software stack. So you're fundamentally delivering a service to your customers, whether that's internal, sort of external. And at the end of the day, there's a number of components involved in that. And it's anything from sort of Windows servers, all these bits on top of it, monitoring tools. And the very top of that stack typically is the actual application. And then you've got a service wrapper around that. And when you've got a significant number of services, all these things add up. And even being able to nibble at marginal costing and cost reduction makes a huge difference. You have to find better ways to do things. Vulnerability scanning, testing and things, they're absolutely huge areas. I work for one organization where we're supporting over 1,000 apps. And the software stack, some of those things add upwards of 30, 40 items in the stack. And it's an absolute nightmare actually trying to keep those up to date and things. And what was happening, most organizations typically update one thing at a time. They patch one thing.
Yes.
In reality, if you actually look at that as a whole, we go to the point where we rebuild the stack, we go to the latest and everything. You bring in automated testing, and we will look at 10 to 1 sort of cost reductions in this sort of maintenance cost of maintaining that, making sure that the stack's secure.
Yes. And on that stack side, Steve, I've heard an argument that says this might also lead us into a bit of a discussion about build versus buy, but if you look at the SaaS provided software, a lot of that patching and everything is just behind the curtain. So obviously you've got to do your due diligence that it's actually happening, because otherwise you don't know what you're buying into. But if we just say you have done your due diligence, and you could also say that software company is providing services to 100 customers, so they've got the economy of scale to keep everything up to date, etc. There's a big argument, isn't it, for going for a SaaS service rather than sort of building your own, where you have this sort of, I suppose back to that point we were talking about hardware spend, you might really need another 10 or 15 people to do patching at the right level, but you just simply cannot afford to do that. And before we kind of get more maybe into the SaaS side of things, there is a big build versus buy decisions. What's your approach on making those sorts of decisions as to whether you should build something or buy something?
Yeah, it's sort of changed fundamentally these days, because cloud certainly changed some of the underlying sort of metrics and things around this. It sort of depends what you're building. I've seen a number of things over the years when you've been on the sidelines and people have made decisions and thought, I'm not sure necessarily the way I would have gone. I would say there's certain things, I would not build. If you've got a common off-the-shelf package, at reasonable sort of pricing and things, why on earth would you sort of build your own equivalent? It's very unlikely you can sort of build it cheaper. And I think that's going to change radically in the next few years. We'll see what happens. There's different sort of drivers behind this at the second. But
so Steve, I'm just picking up on what you just said then. So do you think it's going to be more build your own in the next few years because tech is going to be easier to build, or do you think it's going to still be more buy stuff?
A lot of SaaS products are starting to look expensive at the minute, and particularly when you understand the full life cycle costs and things. And it's something to be wary of. I was having a very interesting conversation a few weeks ago with a colleague who was actually talking about people are starting to clone SaaS tools at the minute. And there was an example where someone actually managed to clone a very well-known SaaS product in 3 days and used AI fundamentally to build this. And I think what you're going to find is the more complicated SaaS tools, there's barriers to entry there, which makes it more difficult to do that, really because of the whole ecosystem things they've got around that. And some of the simpler, cheaper ones, unless they bring their pricing down, the thing when you look at the tools, you can go to AI now and actually describe something like AI built it. Is it production ready? That's an interesting dilemma. But it's certainly been to Azure, use some of the Microsoft sort of no-code tools in there, and they're scalable by default. And as they build the AI and the Copilot stuff in there, you're built into CRMs, other things quite easily, and it's probably good enough to go.
It's really interesting, and it's going to be the kind of benefit of hindsight, isn't it, in a couple of years to look back. But I suppose you were talking about lifecycle costs, and it's when you build any software, it's less than 10% of the lifecycle cost of that software, because even if you can write code really quickly, or you can get AI to basically give you the modules, you've still got to have product management. You still got to think about releases. And keeping the thing going.
Absolutely.
I think personally that threat, if you like, might be the thing that meters the SaaS software running away.
Yep.
Because the SaaS folks are going to be saying, well, if we don't change, we're going to lose our shirts. So it's always tricky to predict the future, but it might be that becomes the lever that you've got in procurement, when you're talking to your big SaaS provider to say, look, we don't want to have our own version, but looking at your price, it's getting very close to the cost it would be for us to just run it ourselves. Do you think would that be a negotiating tactic potentially in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the vendors are going to find it very hard to differentiate. There was a classic book years ago called Guerrilla Marketing, about 20 years ago, and fundamentally sort of broke the market up into three things. But top end, you've got the gorillas, almost SAP, some things, best product and things, but, high pricing. The other end, you've got new entrants, new build, probably 10% of the functionality became in 10% of the price. And all we can do, most of the things the big guys can do, you have a few in the middle who sort of halfway house and things. But I think we're going to see more of that. So you overlay that with the ability to sort of code things which will become production ready. Logic apps and with the other things already give you mechanisms to build, scale, back up, you name it. There may be an architecture thing, but it's disappearing, I think, over time.
Yeah, things are becoming commodities.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you mentioned about, I think your example was either Visio or Microsoft Project, or the two classics, yeah. And I think that kind of ties back, doesn't it, to that observation, which is most software, less than 10% of its functionality is actually used. There's a very famous, word processing system. And if you actually sort of sat down and worked out all the different things it does, it would probably take you a month. But people are still just writing letters on them. Point I was going to make is I've used tools that actually can lean in a bit more than just sort of asset register and actually tell us, how many times this particular piece of software was used, that sort of thing. And how long people used it for. What we haven't been able to do is lean in to go, and they used 3% of the functionality. We can't do that. But there is the ability to lean in more. And I think that's one of those things which is a bit like when you made that observation about frameworks, that sometimes the IT service just is on autopilot. You get one of these, you get one of those, that's your new joiner set, etc. And no one's looking back and going, well, hang on a minute, usage is tailing off, or something else is being used.